Ladies and gentlemen, and damn near everything else, I'm Layman Pascal, and if you've tuned in to see our new integral stage mascot, Jedediah the non-dual mule, then I'm not sorry to say you just missed him, because his luminous not-quiteness is the location of his always alreadiness. Meanwhile, we're here in the Liminal Café with someone who crawls around in an I Ching infused playground of developmental complexity, spiritual maturity, stage models, confusions, conflations, and maybe we'll touch on the lingering traces of Election Day USA. Here to tell us how his critique of developmental colonialism helps further the cause of developmental colonialism by making it sneakier and disguising it with an altruistic self-critique is Alexander Love. Hi, Alexander. Good to see
Hey,
you.
Pascal. Layman, it's lovely to be here with you.
What are you listening to lately? What kind of music's going on in there?
Oh, music. So for me, music is I lately is going to be either Pat Martino or some sort of nameless, faceless, melancholic piano music that's uh, floating through the background as I write.
Ambient, faceless piano music. I love it. Why don't you plug the course you're doing before we go any further?
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to be doing with Stages International. I am going to be teaching their Recognizing Developmental Stages course, which is a course that takes people from, oh, I'm really interested in stages and I've read books about it, but every time I look at another human being, I don't really know if I'm seeing stages clearly. It's a course to invite folks into learning how to do such a thing. We use videos, movies, and group exploration. It's really, really fun.
This is how to be judgmental of other people but better.
No, it's the opposite of that. It's how to be deeply discerning with an open, developmentally compassionate heart in such a way that I can understand other human beings more deeply so that I can love them more fully and be more inclusive.
That sounds better. You were mentioning that one of the things that's kind of a creative burr in your saddle, so to speak, lately is um, the tendency of people to conflate lower stages with shadows of stages that they don't particularly like. What's on your mind around that stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, we just had an election in the US that has produced any number of eruptions in human beings. And, I've noticed among some of my developmentally informed friends that how easy it is for us to say, well, all of the people that didn't vote the way that I did, they must be regressive, lower stage human beings that have essentially no clue. Otherwise, why wouldn't they have agreed with me? And one of the things that's occurred to me in this is that there's a conflation between lower stages, or I would prefer to say earlier stages, and shadow dynamics. That just because someone is acting in a negative way doesn't mean that they are at an earlier stage. That every stage of development has its own shadow. It's just as we grow up, the complexity of how we screw things up becomes more complicated.
I love the idea that there's advanced negativity. What about the possibility, like, there's another element that kind of becomes problematic here because uh, there is a confusion between earlier stages and things that we have an allergy to or that we have an intergroup response against. But there's also the possibility of people being mistaken about stages, whereby you go, well, like the qualities of a particular state of complexity might appear as non-desirable, even if they aren't the shadow version of that stage. It's just that to another stage, it might look like something nobody would want.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to me, this brings us into the territory of looking at what is the difference between the content that a human being can be speaking, can be interacting with, can be behaving based upon. How is that different from a developmental structure, which is much more, in my experience, it's much more essential. And we can put colors in it that are going to be informed by this moment in history. But underneath, it's like it reminds me of I took a course with this woman who was teaching us how to tell stories. And she handed us these little pieces of paper called story, and written on them were these things that she called story bones. And she said, okay, I'm giving out story bones. I want all of you to put the flesh on it. I want you to actually create the story, but the story bones are the must-haves. And often the must-haves, developmentally speaking, are in some ways much less human than we might imagine. They're much more fundamental to the fabric of the cosmos. It's really when the content comes in that a lot of us start getting judgy about everything. And we often have seen, for example, that we might see progressively looking values that maybe we would initially associate with like a 4.0 or a green kind of stage of development. But then we look more closely and we realize that actually these so-called sort of relativistic values, these postmodern values, are actually being held in a amber or a 2.5 or a blue kind of structure. So that helps us that example kind of helps us differentiate between, okay, well, there's a structure of a stage, and then there's the content that we're pouring into it.
Mm. Yeah, one of the things I really like about the way Terry holds developmental stages is that she's very upfront about the fact that the structures of the stages permit development as the social context changes through history. And one of the places we see that the most dramatically in our news media is conformists take different forms over time. And interestingly enough to me, sometimes it seems like the greatest social friction is between two groups or two types of people at the same level, so to speak, but using different phraseology, right? So certain forms of MAGA and woke seem to behave and have a very similar vibe, even though they have different terminology and different flags. And that's a real friction point in a way that's more intense than most of the other cultural friction points.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I live in Boulder. I mean, that's the, as you put it, sort of MAGA versus woke. We Boulder is really, really good at producing a kind of woke ideology that offers no room for departure into another way of looking at it. Of course, not everywhere in Boulder, but there's certain hubs that we really have this cooking.
So here's a thing we could parse a little bit. I'd like to get your take on the difference between two things that often get confused and conflated. And one of them is um, what the spiral dynamics and integral people would call green, a sort of post-formal reflexivity in how they deal with thought and language and cognition, which allows them to really understand critiques of systems, including the systems that are active in themselves as they speak. So they become very sensitive to the structure of the discussion and what was being left out and how values are being arranged inside terms and things like that. So that's on the one side. The other side is this uh, kind of old fashioned, maybe earlier stage, conformist, blue amber, somewhere in that cluster of signifiers, tendency for a kind of courtly political correctness, right? So you can imagine that in a feudal type system where a lot of people are dominated by a pre-modern sociocognitive style, that nonetheless the people who live around the king, they have to be constantly aware of what the current language trends are and how those are reflecting status and respect. You don't want to inadvertently call the queen the wrong thing. You want to know who's on what side. You want to know which family, which group, which ethnicity, which person gets to have the up leveling respect signifiers or the down leveling respect signifiers. So when we look at the phenomenon of political correctness, How do we tease apart this kind of old fashioned hyper conformity of the courtesans around which terms are giving who the appropriate amount of respect right now, and this more sophisticated kind of self reflexive analysis of how bias and value is built into speech acts?
Yeah, so a couple things come up for me. One, I like to look at the developmental framework more like a harp rather than a set of stairs. And so it is entirely possible that within the fabric of one human being, there are functioning both of what you're describing at the same time that may be showing up at the same time. On the other hand, what occurs to me about the green or the 4.0 is that one of the things that we're contending with here is a profound increase in sensitivity within the relational sphere. And so in this dynamic, we are very aware of the sensation of harm being caused and us
Mm,
causing harm. And so this can also create a kind of stepping, trying not to step on the eggshells. It's trying not to create a stir and fiercely denouncing anyone who may do that because 4.0 is opening into this subtle realm that doesn't automatically make contact with an unbroken dimension of being, which would actually allow for a lot more resiliency as they're developing this kind of relational subtlety.
okay, let's imagine a political scenario in which you have a bunch of people, you have some progressives, some people who are really green pluralistic sensitives, but you also have both achievers and conformists who take advantage of those value laden symbols as part of their identity and their social interaction. The conformist conforms to the, let's say, kind of almost tribalistic use of those symbols, but the achiever is capable of saying any bullshit that they think might help them succeed at their tasks.
Mhm.
Including all marketing, all kind of formals, the skill of giving speeches and trying to hit value notes in audiences. How does an outside observer tell the difference between whether it's a conformist or an achiever pretending to be pluralistic?
Well, I think a couple things. One, we first need to be inside of our body and be listening from a place that is deeper than the parts of the self that are going to first be in a hyper-reactive mode. So what I notice very common throughout most all human beings is that there is an easy tendency for parts of the self, which by definition have a partial view, take over the self without recognizing it. And so at the very start, to respond to your question, at the very start of things, are we able to listen from a place that is deeper than you could say perspectival rigidity, right? We think about like a perspectival freedom from perspective, not as if we are separate from perspective ourselves, but that there is a freedom to move between perspectives. This immediately allows for very simply a degree of ease with which we're paying attention. From that place of ease, of paying attention, we can now begin to listen more closely to where are the dimensions of shadow, where are the dimensions of manipulation, how do the expressions of health and manipulation occur in these different examples that you're giving. And then it opens us up for possibility around asking questions. One of the things that I've been curious about in this particular election is the degree to which, as human beings are trying to make sense of this, how often are we asking questions and how often are we making declarations? It's really easy to make sense of everything that's happening by doing a quick developmental read, becoming certain about what it is that's happening, and then just claim that. Well, this deeper place of ease, this deeper place of listening, allows for something else to occur, where we're really in a place of question. and then in a place of question again. So that rather than answering the question that you've asked, I think it's a question that we need to be exploring very, very deeply. How do we tell? And also, how do we tell what those deeper values look like in those three different options that you offered? How do we tell when there is authentic expression of value? I'm making a choice to vote MAGA because of deep values that occur within my system. When that 3.5 orange is trying to do its marketing, to what degree is this manipulation? To what degree is this coming from a deeper place of values? And I think that this then starts to allow us to ask questions and talk to people. I don't think, Layman, that we can answer that question in an honest way until we have lots of conversations with human beings who we don't understand. And this is where the recognizing developmental stages comes in, because recognizing developmental stages, it begins with the premise of developmental compassion. That every single human being has the right to be at whatever developmental stage they are at, and that wherever someone is expressing developmentally, they are part of a collective fabric of which we are all a part. So that 2.5 amber exists in me, not as some sort of like, oh, it exists in me, and so whatever, look how great I am. Like, it really lives in me. And so how deeply am I willing to touch that as I'm listening to another person and holding them with true dignity, not dignity that has this air of, oh, look how much I'm holding you in dignity because I'm secretly so beyond you and I'm embracing you. Like, that's a bunch of nonsense. But we all do it, right? We all do it when we know about developmental stages. So the invitation here is, how do I find a place of listening where I can really begin to assess these deep structures
Hmm.
in another human being, and then talk to another human being, and then talk to another human being? Because with any assessments, the biggest issue we run into, one of the biggest issues we run into, is that the assessment creates separation between the looker and the one that's being looked at. The question that I have is, how can we use these kinds of assessment tools and recognition tools to bring us closer to a place of deep understanding our sort of shared human threads?
I got this flash of one of my stepdaughters saying, talking about her boyfriend at the time and how he was really getting involved with a lot of misogynist, hypermasculinist, achiever stuff on the internet. And she said, I wouldn't mind so much if I thought these were his actual values, but I think he's just repeating what the algorithm gives him.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it sort of brings in the question of AI for me there, because obviously as a human, you have the opportunity to shift into a different somatic place and hold the other person differently and kind of give yourself the wiggle room between perspectives and try to locate your own authentic version of what you think is the authenticity underlying what they're saying. But when it comes to the question of, well, how would I teach my chatbot to discern how this was going? You said a really interesting thing, which is about questions, because we can't give the machines that organismic adjustment thing
Yeah.
yet, maybe never. But we certainly could add to programs that are designed to analyze the complexity of speech acts, a follow up series of questions or inquiries designed to try to flesh out the assessment that it's given. That might be an interesting step forward.
It sure would be. I think also talking to Tom Murray would be an interesting conversation, because I think he's looking into that.
Yeah, yeah, I love Tom's work. Um, one of the things that came up for me also around when you shifted your body, which is how you immediately began in your response there, it brings up vibe, it brings up style, it brings up affective subtleties that aren't necessarily located in the objective structure of the statement. And for myself, that's always been a really big inquiry, always for some for some amount of time. I don't know how long. Um, but one of the things in the integral community that always struck me was how much they focused on content as an indicator of something like level or structure, especially when it came to art and entertainment. Because it's very easy to look at everything everywhere all at once and go, whoa, this is a meta modern high level movie because structurally it's portraying a multiverse that's overcome and different versions of people converge. It looks very much like a cognitive map of a higher stage. But when it comes to Barbie, it's much more difficult to figure out whether that's a second tier artifact or not, because you have to go a lot more on the mood, on the vibe, on the style. It's not instantiated in the architecture as much. I'm curious about how you think about style as representing structure versus content as representing structure, or how or if that comes up for you.
Well, I think what comes up for me here is that, I'm really sort of influenced by Ken Wilber, as many of us are. And there's this recognition that we have our epistemic lens, we have our the view, the perspectives that we're taking. And then we have the arising ontology. We have the reality of being. Now, Wilbur talks about methodology. I like to use the word sympoiesis instead, this kind of becoming with the world, because I like that word because it includes any methodology that we might interact with. It includes any practices that we might be involved with. But it has a bit of a more organic, relational feel to it. And so to me, these three things you can look at like a Venn diagram, like they're not separate things. They're all co-arising. And very often in the developmental world, it feels as if that we've been sort of leaning towards just looking at perspective. What is the perspective of your mind? How complex is the perspective of your mind? And of course, that's important. But at the very same time, there is this co-arising with the reality of being, the way in which we are arising in the world and the way in which we are becoming with the world. And I think that here is where style may come into it. And the question that comes up for me is, at what level of depth are we assessing style? Are we looking at the sort of the deeper nature of the stylistic nature of someone's soul? Are we looking at the style that has been incorporated through, enculturation and sort of the realms in which we've grown up, and how, I wiggle like my father, or I, ask questions like my mother, or those kinds of things? Or are we looking at the deep structures of the cosmos, the most finest threads of fabric that have their own natural expressions and style? For instance, when we're looking at the stages model, when we look at the let's say 1.0, 3.0, 5.0, this sort of deep structure style is one of receptivity, is one of entering into a new world that we don't know. We don't know where we are. The question is, who am I? And the style is a receptive orientation to being and becoming. When we look at 1.5, 3.5, 5.5, that style shifts to this yang, this more active expression. 2-year-olds are going to grab things through it. Orange is going to try to manipulate things in a more subtle way. 5.5 is going to start weaving together cross paradigmatic systems and sort of smashing boundaries into each other to weave one larger meta system. And so on it goes. 2.0, 4.0, 6.0, we're going to have the deep structure style is reciprocity, the sort of moving in relationship with. The 2.5, 4.5, 6.5, this is going to have an interpenetrative style. Now, I can be, let's say, in 2.5 amber, and I can have that deep structure style of interpenetration, which means I am going to become the same, the rules, the sort of the group think, we're all going to become the same. We all have tofu on our plates because we all believe the same thing about reincarnation, and we're all kind of, everything concretely is going to look the same. But then within that, I have my own personality style, which is going to be a different flavor of motion or becoming with the world, or a way of arising.
Well, I love that you immediately went to styles of style.
Mhm.
Um, there's a really interesting documentary called Exporting Raymond, where the guy who created the sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond is hired to replicate the sitcom in Russia. And this documentary follows him, right? So it's the same scripts, same characters, same project. We're going to televise this and receive money. So structurally, it's pretty similar, but the difference between his take on the aesthetics of the show and the Russian government and TV stations take is remarkable. They want all the characters to have like really expensive, good looking suits, and all the women should be like busty and wearing the latest outfits. And he's like, that's not funny. Right? But it doesn't even compute for, he wants them to be bedraggled so that there's comic counterpoint. So I love that as an example of
Yeah,
that's two different stylistic evaluation styles around the same structure and content.
that's
One
right.
thing that came up though is so when we throw Wilbur into the mix, one thing that he does very prominently that's not as prominent in Terry's approach, even though there are different aspects and functions to the stages, is this thing about lines, right?
Uh-huh.
So in the Wilberian approach, there's a attempt to do a schematic of different parts or different capacities in individuals operating simultaneously at different stages of complexity. What's your general feeling about lines as an analytical tool?
Yeah, well, I guess what comes up for me is that on the one hand, I think it's really valuable because it's helping us, it's a differentiation tool. So it's helping us know ourselves more fully, more deeply. On the other hand, any differentiation tool can begin to break down into rigidity, where it's like, oh, now I have my emotion practice, and now I have my states practice, and now I have my somatic practice. And that's all welcome and beautiful and valuable. But I think that what it brings up for me is the question, what happens when our understanding of lines also grows up? So that more and more there is a capacity for weaving, for everything to be woven together, while still respecting and honoring the value of the differentiation. I will say, and this is something that is probably less public when it comes to the stages model in terms of what's written, but when it comes to being a scorer, we are definitely looking at emotional threads and cognitive threads and intersubjective threads and all of these different territories that we might, if we wanted to language them as lines, we could. It's not really how we're looking at them from the perspective of scoring. But what we are doing is we're saying, okay, here's a whole human landscape. What are these various dimensions of the human landscape? And are there areas that need to be broadened out or grown up? So if we look at the trajectory of emotions, there's an understanding of, oh, well, sort of there's concrete emotions, there's subtle emotions, and then there's meta-aware tones of being. And so when uh, we're looking at and working with a human being, we can hold those questions, and the stages model does indeed do this, hold the questions of, okay, given what their developmental capacities are their emotional capacities in line with that? Or do they only speak about concrete emotions, but they show advanced subtle capacities? And so I think even though Terry doesn't speak about it as lines, it's baked in to how we're listening with someone. Um, because the overall intention is, how do we broaden out this system so that it is as robust going down Do we have strong, healthy foundational stages as well as robust as it's growing up and growing deep?
If you had to choose between having one of your threads be the most advanced the world has ever seen, but the rest of your thematic functions not really aligned with that, or being sort of in the middle of the pack, developmentally speaking, but having all your functions integrated at the same level of sophistication. Which one sounds to you like you would prefer it?
I would prefer the second option because I've worked with the thing I love about Terry Stage's model is how precise it is. And I've worked with people as a coach for many years, and I've seen really young folks that have some construct aware 5.0 capacities, but they're like early 20s. They've barely developed an ego structure, a healthy ego structure, and things are already starting to fall to pieces. And not only that, there hasn't been sufficient exploration of shadow work because they simply haven't bumped into it yet many of the times. And so I think overall, what I'm interested in is a human collective that is able to listen to each other. And listening is something that can occur fairly early. I mean, 2.0 has a value of inclusion and friendship. Now, of course, 2.0 can probably we'd call this maybe like magic, mythic, sort of early amber to kind of if depending on what language folks are using. Now, of course, that stage of development can easily go off the rails into exclusivity and us and them and all that kind of stuff. But its deeper virtue is just very basic friendship. So most human beings on this planet have the ability to do that. And so for me, it's less about how do we get later and get more advanced. Because also, I'd like to mention that a lot of times that viewpoint isn't looking at development as a distributed expression of self. Where am I at? Where are you at? Is a different question than what are all the different developmental tonalities in the fabric of the cosmos, or specifically in the fabric of humanity. I'm really interested, and I know Terry feels this way too. I'm really interested in developmental health and integration. Because if our goal is to get everybody skinny and tall, given the world we're in, I don't know that that's a fair request. At the same time, if the call is to invite healthy collectives where people are held with dignity and respect, and there's a deeper interest in connecting with the virtues, the developmental virtues that they have access to, and how do we draw those out? I think then we would have a very different experience of being human.
Do you think part of the cultural polarization that we see, at least in the way it's framed in popular discourse, is between people who are a little taller but narrower and people who are a little shorter but wider?
I'm not sure. I think what I would say is that I think that many people in the progressive world would like to think that they are taller. But I don't know if that is exactly what's going on. I think that again, I could make assertions here, but personally around the election and what the hell is going on, I'm in more of a place of not knowing and a place of not coming up with ideas around what the hell is happening and how did we get here. I suspect that there is a lot less more developmental advancement in the progressive world than we might like to think. And so I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
And of course, it depends on what we think the progressive world is pointing toward.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's an interesting question around. Okay, so I went to see Barbie with my mother,
Yeah.
and she was not that impressed. I was very impressed that a coherent vibe was maintained through shifting genres and perspectives, which I thought was a good, reasonably high level indicator. But she thought it might be evidence of a kind of a sociopathic corporate attitude that was simply indifferent to the inconsistencies between those different approaches. Now, something similar comes up for me around a character like Donald Trump, and he's not alone in this, which is you can listen to him reverse his positions in a single sentence, right? And that triggers something in us that reminds us of higher level integration of seeming opposites. So how do you parse those apart, right? Because
Oh,
some people have this like he's playing five-dimensional chess and you're like, is
yeah.
he or is he
Yeah.
indifferent to inconsistencies between perspectives?
Well, again, I think, well, a couple things come up. One, I think it's really easy to project our developmental capacity onto the world. This is something that we look at in scoring and in developmental coaching all the time. When am I taking what I have access to and saying my client has access to that? And there's various reasons why we might do that. And also the other dimension to this is being able to suss out the difference between mental illness or some sort of psychological uh, diagnostic pattern and developmental complexity. So if someone, for example, is, losing their cognitive capacity to express a coherent sentence, this is not an expression of advanced developmental capacities. And this is actually, it brings up an interesting question.
But he's gone beyond language.
Yes, yes. I think we're looking at the pre-trans, the pre-trans here. It's like, is it
Yeah.
pre-linguistic or post-linguistic, right? And and I see this also happen with people that are entering into the metaware stages, when they start moving into the 5.0, where their language can, in that early construct aware, that the language can start to get very disarticulated. One of the reasons why it's getting disarticulated is because they are in that receptive style. That deep structure is in a receptive style, and they are taking in a whole new world that they have no real idea what is happening. And so, what will occur is all of these thoughts will stream in a million miles a minute and then get deconstructed on the spot. And so, they're trying to say something coherently, but what's actually happened is all of this internal deconstruction and like flying in from everywhere, it makes it very difficult to sound coherent. Many folks in their surroundings will often give them feedback because they don't know what's happening, that they start sounding crazy. And so, this is again why it's so helpful to understand how to listen for those deep structures, because then we can hear, oh, actually, this person probably has 3.5 capacities, but doesn't seem to be using them very much anymore. Or they have an expression of a 3.5, 1.5, or orange and red pathology with some psychological diagnostic issues that are occurring. And so that even though that structure is there might be some regression patterns that are occurring. And that's why having that recognition is so important, because then we can start to suss this stuff out instead of just saying like, you're this.
One of the interesting things about Adi Da's weird autobiography is a moment early on in his life where he's having these breakthroughs that are, for him, the summation and completion of everything that he's been existentially hoping for and working on. He's like, it's finally succeeding. And everyone he tells, I think he's at university at the time, recommends therapy, thinks he's having a dangerous breakdown. Now, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But what he realizes is, oh, I'm saying it wrong. Right? I'm saying it like it's a breakdown, but I think it's a step up.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
there's something about language training that might be important, right? So there are courses where you can get better at the diagnostic nuances, but are you guys also involved in helping people to get better at articulating the stages that they're working with and coming from?
Well, absolutely. So this is, the invitation, the way, at least the way that the way that I'm holding the stages model is that there's questions of, okay, where's the leading edge? What are they growing into? Where's the trailing edge? Where is the sort of earlier developmental features that are in support of their experience? Where is the shadow? And when we're looking at their sort of center of gravity, which, by the way, for me, and most people will probably disagree with me on this, but for me, the center of gravity slides around a little bit. I don't like to think of the center of gravity as you are orange, because the reality is that as contexts shift, people kind of wiggle around a little bit. They sort of hover. Um, but when we're looking at the center of gravity, then the question is, how integrated, how deep, how full of a relationship do you have with those capacities? And part of that can be, as we get facility there, there's an ability to use language and to express ourselves from that place, as well as to behave from that place, to go into motion from that place. So I'm thinking about, there was a moment in my life where I was going through a developmental transition. That new stage of development that was coming online, I could be with it when I was walking very, very slowly. I could be with it in meditation. I could be with it when I was just driving in the car by myself. But as soon as I went into a teaching dynamic, I immediately needed to use the stage right before it as a way to interact. I just didn't know how to speak from that next later developmental wave of being. And so I think that our ability to speak freely from a particular perspective, from a particular stage of development, um, has a lot to do with how fully we have embodied it, how robust it is in our lives. And so certainly as a developmental coach, as we're assessing, are we working with the leading edge? Are we working with shadow? Are we working with broadening out that center of gravity? That's the moment, if we're working with the center of gravity, that we can explore how to help the person more fully inhabit that stage of development. Or if they want to work with that leading edge, it's the same idea. How do we live into this, and how do we just speak a little bit from here to see how the whole world changes as we inhabit that new domain?
I love the ethic implied by speaking from it in different spaces a little bit to test it out, because it doesn't seem like it's always the case that you want to speak from your leading edge in every context, right? So I certainly have noticed that. I mean, I push my communication pretty far, but there's a definite limit about what I think anybody's able to hear, right? If I'm going to write an article or host a podcast, I don't want to speak from my actual leading edge.
Yeah.
I want to speak to the rough edges of the bulk of the people I imagine will be listening, at least my idealized listener, but not too far beyond that, even if those are options for me.
Well, exactly. Exactly. And I think you're pointing to something really important here, because there is our what's occurring within us, and then there's how we are in relationship with. And I think that this is a feature that starts to come online strongly at 4.5, or teal, early teal. This ability for recognizing that I need to shift where I'm coming from in order to speak powerfully and effectively, in whatever context that I'm in. And so I agree, there's a degree of compassion there. And I know for sure that whenever we're having conversations, I have to stay super focused on, like, okay, I want to make sure I understand what he's saying. And every time you speak and I understand what you're saying, I feel so excited. There's like a celebration there, because, like, I know what he means. Right. And I think
But,
this is,
yep.
but now if you sort of, to use a sort of regular sort of word here, if you dumbed it down too much, then I wouldn't feel stretched in that cognitive domain, because I feel like you often stretch me cognitively in this sort of, like, the way that you use language and the sophistication that you have. it brought, so like, how do we come from who we are in such a way that really stretches but also holds those
Yeah.
that we're
Yeah,
interacting with?
that's a great point because there's a real sweet spot there, right? If we wanted to cultivate a more deliberately developmental civilization, then we would want people pushing the edge with each other, but within a set of parameters appropriate to what they're capable of and what the audience and the context is. You like find where that becomes symbiotically synced up, but then also push just to the top edge of whatever that is.
Yeah, whether we're pushing to the top edge or we're pushing to greater depths, or we're, I'm thinking of my daughter who's 15, and it's like this is where recognizing the stages is so beautiful because what she cares about is a little bit different than what I would automatically care about. I'm not I'm not in the bathroom working on my hair for long periods of time. And for her, it's an act of love. It's an act of self-care. It's an act of presenting herself in her world in a way that feels authentic to who she is. And for me to recognize the developmental gifts and tendencies and features of her, it allows me to love her without asking her to be something different. And I think there's something to be said for loving someone so deeply that that in and of itself, and I don't mean love like I think I love you, but the presence of loving so deeply and allowing someone to be in that uh, whatever world they're living in, to love them there so deeply that that opens the heart, it opens connection. And I think that that might be one of the necessary conditions for development to unfold smoothly outside of my own time frame. I'm remembering when Sophia, my daughter, was younger, someone told her about fairies. She must have been 6 years old, 7 years old. This changed the course of her life. She got a fairy station, which is like an altar, and she had all these things on it. Every single night, the fairies would bring her a little teeny piece of fruit, and then she would write letters to the fairies, and the fairies would write letters back to her. And this became a multi-year relationship with the magic world. And then came what in Waldorf education they call the 9-year change. This is when a certain kind of concrete logic starts to kind of flash in. It's like, hey, wait a minute. How is Santa Claus getting to all of these places on time? And she would ask questions like, is Santa Claus real? And I would say, well, do you mean subtly real or do you mean concretely real? And at first she was sort of perturbed by that. But then she couldn't, I wouldn't stop asking those questions. So then she's like, oh, I mean concretely real. Like, is he a thing? And so my point is that I partnered with her through that transition to the point when she was ready to have a conversation with us about, okay, what is Santa Claus? What is the history of St. Nicholas? What does he represent as a subtle expression of goodness and generosity? And now you're old enough, given you've asked enough questions, you're old enough to know that Santa Claus isn't concretely real. But I know so many people that are literally embodiments of Santa Claus. They grow the beard. They do the whole thing. There's even Santa Claus universities where people are practicing entering into this archetypal disposition of Santa Claus. And what I noticed is that Sophia never felt like we lied to her, which we often see with some kids. Instead, she felt like she was now part of the next phase of being human, where she could now support the younger ones in living in that magic world because she now understood something as she grew up. So I say this just to offer an example of how I didn't try to stretch her developmentally. 4.5 is going to want to stretch people developmentally. Maybe 5.5 is going to want it because they're active and they want to kind of push sometimes people. And there's beauty in that. But I also want to offer that when there's deep love and um, developmental allowing with deep love inside of that, evolution often just occurs by itself, just as it needs to.
Hmm. That's a lovely point, and I think there was another lovely point embedded in the beginning of your response in terms of uh, the intimate relationship is an excellent place to learn the values that are placed into things that we don't necessarily have a lot of valuation experience around, right? And this comes back to that point about content, because if I expect that higher stages or higher values or particular kinds of virtues or states are associated with a certain content, then I'm going to unfairly judge a lot of other people as not having access to that when really they're just doing it through something I'm not used to doing it through or through something I don't even like, right? I think that's one of the big religious problems, right? The classic history of the monotheisms is, well, clearly these pagans can't be doing it. The content of their icon is different than ours.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's a lot of possibility for something like developmental colonialism around that insufficient appreciation of the potential forms of each of these things. Um, yeah, that's all. Not a question.
Exactly. Well, I think you're spot on there. And I mean, that's the thing that I'm inviting myself to kind of keep watch on. To what degree am I subtly or overtly holding the position that if you didn't vote the way I voted, you must be less sophisticated or less evolved than me? And I think this is a huge mistake. I think it's a huge mistake because it completely shuts down the possibility for asking questions. I've already come up with a conclusion. You're a regressive freak, unlike me, who have all of these developmental capacities. All we're doing is we're just shutting down conversation. We're
That might be all we're doing, but there's just occurred to me there's another interesting feature here because one of the arguments you sometimes hear is that people who are progressive or liberal or sort of working in that left space, that they often don't have a good integration of aggression. And the argument is often made that other people, maybe not as educated as you, but they've got a better handle on their aggression. Now, is the attempt to judge and dismiss people in a kind of developmental racism sense, nonetheless, also possibly at times an attempt to revivify the very aggression that's led to insufficient cultural activity on the part of these people. Like
well,
if
I
they
mean,
could just own that judgment a little bit more and the warmth and fire that it brings, would they
yeah.
be succeeding and moving ahead in a richer, more authentic way, which would be useful to all of us?
Well, I think if they're owning it, this would be fantastic. The concern that I have is the disowning of it, where where it becomes a disowned power that's being then projected. Because that's what, an election like this, it's a perfect time for projection. Everybody's projecting their own psyches onto what, quote unquote, what happened. And I think that certainly if there is a group of human beings that are traditionally avoidant of aggression, that's going to be a perfect scenario, psychological scenario for that aggression to be projected onto you guys are the problem. And so I agree with you. I think that um, if there's a willingness to look at that and then own it, then there's room to reclaim that healthy power instead of, just having more refined aggression.
Okay, so another interesting thing's come up for me here because at some of the right, one of the things you see at Green
Yeah.
is this tendency of people to be like, well, aggression is in itself bad, and the only time you're allowed to be aggressive is at aggressive people, right? And that puts them in a weird shadow problem.
Yeah.
But when you look at let's say, stages that are not as interested in the consistency of their positions, right? And that the pre-orange, pre-modern, that kind of person is not as experienced in or invested in the kind of thing we associate with reason and science, which is the attempt to make your statements jive with facts and jive with your other statements. So for them, there's not necessarily a sense that they are um, engaged in some kind of shadow problem in the same way. Like if I was part of an amber blue team and my actual value was my team wins no matter what. And so I denounce you for being a dictator when you're on the other team, but I don't mean I'm against dictators. I mean I'm in favor of my team having a dictator, and I don't experience any inner conflict around that the way somebody at a more sophisticated level might. So I'm doing a thing that looks like their shadow, but for me it might not be shadow. Does that make
Right.
sense? Yeah.
Perfect sense. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, I think you used the word reason. We have this, we have sort of like a 3.5 orange capacity for rationality. But then there's also a concrete forms of rationality, like, well, Jesus is the savior, and he is a supernatural being. Therefore, he can walk on water. I mean, that's logical, but it's based on a certain premise that is based on certain concrete rules. And so I perfectly agree with you. And I think that it's
I know you're a war hero, but you're not wearing a flag pin, so I guess it doesn't make sense to say that you're actually patriotic. Right? The form of reasoning is there in a very concrete sense. Yeah.
right. That's right. And but then it brings up questions like, okay, that's good. So like, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And how do we handle being in a world where all of this is happening at once? All of this is
So
occurring.
there's what do we do about it, and there's, and I don't want to put it this way, who do we do it to, right? It's like, where is the maximum leverage point? Because if you get involved in uh doing courses that are going to nuance and flesh out models that come from very sophisticated levels of development. And you can say, well, this is good for everybody, and we're learning skills that are actually applicable up and down the whole evolving plant. But nonetheless, I'm essentially intervening with people who are roughly at these levels of functionality. And is that the intervention that the world most needs right now? So when you look at the whole tree of society and the species right now in terms of what's trailing and what's leading and everything in between, where do you think the most help could be done?
Well, I think the most help could be done in the domain of listening and understanding. And at each stage of development, the tools that are going to resonate are going to be different. And so for folks that are interested in, listening to a conversation like this, or interested in integral theory or metamodernism and those kinds of things, then learning the tools to be able to recognize stages of development for the purpose of deeper understanding, well, that will resonate. But the idea is that, well, then that set of skills may not, my daughter will roll her eyes at me. If I say, hey, honey, like, take my recognizing stages course, she's going to be like, are you kidding? Like, I want to go to CrossFit with you. Like, I don't want to do that. So for me, it's the most important thing is the understanding and the listening skills. And then asking the question, if we look at the whole tree, as you put it, how do we teach listening skills and willingness to understand people we don't automatically understand? How do we build that out at every level? To me, that's most important, because when it comes down to it, it's like, can I hang out with my neighbor and have a conversation, even if we disagree? And I have friends of mine that have voted for Trump, and it's like, okay, well, can you talk about it? Can you talk about it without it digressing into simply hitting each other with opposing ideas? Can we get to the underlying care? And I think that getting to the underlying care is something that we can do at least from 2.0 on. As soon as we have a second person perspective, we can start learning. I mean, it's what they're doing in ninth grade, for 9-year-olds, 8-year-olds. It's like, okay, you can't hit your friend. And so here's how we work it out. How do we have a conversation? My daughter, her old school, they had these things called no blame meetings. So if stuff was occurring, now, of course, they're bringing in postmodern values to facilitate these no blame meetings. And it's like a sort of a restorative justice kind of format, which is bringing in those values. But nonetheless, it's being done for, young children in this case to learn how to repair. How do we rupture and how do we repair? And I think that in our culture right now, there's a whole lot of rupture with more rupture, with more rupture. And then we have social media algorithms and, media that's supporting a continued separation every time we feel a rupture. The question I have is, what are the tools that we can all learn to turn towards each other when there's a rupture and to explore from a place of not knowing, where do we go from here?
Okay, now you ask some questions.
Well, I'm curious for you, what is, if any, the importance of being able to interact with a human being and know the various stages that are present in them. I'm curious, is that important to you? Have you found usefulness in it? When it's been useful, what has been useful?
I think overall I've found it more useful for like sociological and group and community analysis than for interacting with individuals. Um, Certainly, it was when I first became aware of it, you recognize something, and then that's a flag for a community of people who've also recognized, oh, right, we need to bring the verticality back in and not in a totally ambiguous way. There needs to be some structure to it. And I would have fun tracking myself moving up and down. So sometimes you stub your toe and you have a reaction, then you like watch yourself and you're like, oh, I actually have a corrective, and then a corrective and a corrective. So I see myself slide around and then I watch other people slide around. But it's not that important to me to be able to make diagnostic discriminations because usually I'm trying to look at something that's at the very least more complex and more holistic. And I'm most of the time something that I think is operating between my subconscious and their subconscious and not through any structures I hold in the front of my mind, even if that's a very elaborated developmental map.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious for you, what your sense, when you look out into what's going on in the world now, what do you think is the most important thing? I mentioned listening, I mentioned understanding, developmental compassion. What are some of the things that you feel are most important?
Yeah, that's a tricky question because it's so domain specific in a way. Like, what's most important for the human beings who are capable of it to work on developing in themselves cognitively and emotionally? Yeah, okay, there's some virtues I think we could all get better at. And in fact, just the general concept of virtue and trying to have relationships with virtue as a form of our basic pedagogy and educational system. I do think transformations of the education system are huge going forward in a way that's more community and ecology based and works more on setting us up for the emergence of wisdom rather than just knowledge and skill acquisition, because we don't know what kind of society we're rushing into very quickly. So we can't really preset the skills we need. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to cross training between different subjective intelligence systems, right? Like getting your mental, emotional, and physical, just to name three of those, working on the same kinds of problems so that they can cross fertilize each other and produce something like wisdom. Just that would make a big difference to the educational protocols and ethos. But at the same time, another part of me thinks the most important thing to do right now is make sure the smart machines are have all the information they need in order not to be the worst version of themselves, because that's going to change everything really, really fast. And we're not really aware of it so much because we have a tendency on the one hand to be dismissive, like, okay, we've seen new technologies before. And also everybody engages in hype about how big a change this is going to be. And on the other hand, they're alive and the singularity is coming and everything's going to change. I'm like, neither of those things. But The current versions of AI that we have, that's not the story. The story is 5 years from now, 300 iterations of this thing have gone through, and it's converged with Michael Levin's synthetic biology and Stephen Wolfram's irreducible computations and all sorts of quantum computing systems. There's something that's going to happen when the new tech converges with other leading edge tech, and they're all very close to each other right now. And we are not prepared for that, really. We don't know how to prepare for it. Maybe we shouldn't prepare for it, but that something in there is going to change everything so much that it's
Mm.
hard to gauge how that stands relative to the other kinds of interventions that I would normally think are most desirable and important.
Yeah, beautiful. You want more questions, or is that good?
Yeah, if you got more.
Well, I'm curious. Now, this question sounds like it assumes that you have the capacity to disagree with someone, which I don't want to assume.
How
If you
dare you, sir?
if you had the capacity to disagree with someone,
Hmm.
what do you find uh, is most helpful in entering that kind of dialogue?
I think it really depends on how much established or instinctive trust I have with that person. So, entering a relatively superficial disagreement, right, I'm probably going to take a lot of care to make sure that I'm not only steel manning, but Randicati calls it titanium manning. I'm going to give the best version of their argument. I'm going to run it through all of the versions of myself that can both validate and critique and try to build a synthesized version and see how close or far away from that they are. And also try to undergird that with just a basic recognition and emotional appreciation for their humanness and for the spark of vibrancy out of which their position comes, right? So in a way, I'm being very professional with them, which also suggests I don't have a ton of trust with them, because if it happens in my intimate space at home, I'm going to go for it in a much more personal way. My strategy will be different. It will be, I want to really bring forward my personal response to this so that we can start to work from there. And that's going to be messy.
Mm.
We're going to get to a good place, but that's a strategy based on the fact that we've been through this before and I trust we can get to the other side of it.
Yeah. And what about, I mean, I guess the question comes from sort of what I'm seeing in the world, at least related to the election, that part of the world that is sort of with what's occurred in the US election. I'm curious if you have a sense of what do we do with folks that we simply like so far cannot understand how they could have made the choice that they made. And this could be going from one side or the other side. How do we enter into that?
Yeah, and how much time and energy and emotion are we willing to put into that, right?
Right.
Because I think one of the big problems is if you get a sense that you have the skill to move emotionally and cognitively into a place that understands almost anyone, you want to make sure that you don't burn yourself out in that process, right? You want to make strategic forays.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's easier if you have experiential commonalities. Like one thing I'm really grateful for is growing up in a place that was um, educated hippie on the one hand and farmers and fishermen on the other hand, because that lived experience of the life world of the ruralist allows me to join them in a way that doesn't cost me too much. So I'm like, oh, I know those guys. I know their pleasures and their struggles. I think that's a big part of it is, well, I mean, a big part of it, yeah, it's not conceptual so much. I think this is one of the difficulties.
Yeah.
I look at how do we produce a new civic spirit, for example? How do we produce a religiousness out of our culture? And when were we more successful or less successful with that? And I think the last time we were fairly successful with that was the Second World War, which is one of the reasons Make America Great Again leans back into 1950s values.
Mhm.
because that was a moment where we did something together. We had shared emotions, we had shared efforts, we had shared pleasures. People left their normal cul-de-sacs of social function and they mixed around with each other in a new way. And that lived and embodied experience created a shared understanding. And you can try to force that by trying to think the perspective of the other and relying on your basic sympathetic capacities to feel into another person. But there's a level of ease around it that you're only going to get by having done things with them that mattered.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Beautifully said.
One other thing I would add is it's important to start training ourselves to feel good about cognitive dissonance in all of its modes, including the mode of I can't for the life of me figure out how the fuck you have those values or why you've done those things,
That's right.
right? It just is an absolute incommensurability. But there's a question then of, am I any good at abiding in an incommensurable space, right?
Okay.
Before I can join you, can I even be halfway? Is it okay for me to be vexed in this fashion? If we get better at that, half the problem is solved.
Oh, I think you're really onto something there because if I'm what I notice is that the degree to which I'm uncomfortable with that cognitive dissonance is going to be the degree to which I run quickly to an answer that explains what is happening. I'm not suggesting that always happens, but it does appear to happen quite a lot. I don't like the feeling of cognitive dissonance, so I come up with a meaning-making frame that very often creates more of a division because now I'm certain why I'm justified and you're crazy. And I think that what you're pointing to is super important here because if I'm able and willing to be with that cognitive dissonance, then I have more room for whatever might come next rather than a quick leap to some certainty.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the problems we're looking at here in the discussion we've just had are people making a hasty exit from a complicated energetic circumstance. So if you can abide that circumstance more, you bypass a lot of the problems of those hasty exits.
Exactly. Well said.
Um, why don't you tell us again this course and why people should join it?
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be teaching this recognizing developmental stages course at Stages International. And why I would suggest people jump into this course is that it's a way to learn about developmental stages with the fundamental premise being understanding, listening deeply rather than labeling or diagnosing. We, it's, I mean, it's also quite a bit of fun. We're in a cohort format where we watch videos and we start trying to explore some of the developmental features that are showing up in the videos, and we have group dialogues around what is found. People will have small groups where they dialogue on their own about what they're seeing, and it really helps us get inside of the developmental unfolding that we are. It reminds me of Jeremy Johnson talking about crawling maps. And it's like, I can look at this static map on a page, but to me, development, it's a crawling map in that it is us. The map and the territory are are together. And so I think many of us have had sufficient learning on paper. The question is, how do we start to see through the world to the deeper structures that unite us? We all have these deep developmental structural movements through us. And it can be quite beautiful to learn how to see deeply enough to resonate with that. Because now we're looking beneath the content, we're looking beneath agreement and disagreement. We're looking at something more fundamental. We're listening to the bones of another person's growing pattern. And so if folks are interested in learning development at that level, then this is a great course to kind of get started in that exploration. I know for me as a coach, it's been an incredible, it's the reason why I use this model is because it's been the most effective at supporting my clients, because it's not stages turned into sort of archetypes that I like stick on top of my client, but rather these deep structures allow me to listen to their own creativity, where they might have never worn a suit in their life and they smell like a hippie and they are expressing orange. And that capacity allows me to really start to understand people and see how we're not broken apart from each other.
I love your movements. They suggest a cognitive diagnostic jazz of some kind.
That's what it is. That's what it
And
is.
the other thing, okay, I don't know if this is true. Tell me if this is true. You guys have a drinking game where you watch movies and do a shot every time you identify a 3.5. Is that true?
Well, if whether it's true or not, that you have to be part of the secret society before I can give out that, Layman.
Well, let's alas bring this to an end, but I just like hanging out.
Yeah, I
But
love hanging out with
unfortunately,
you.
this is the end.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. It's lovely spending some time together.